Hello and welcome to the NEWSPASTE podcast. My name's Johnny Vedmore and I'm here with someone really special today, someone who's going to fill up my mind with information. And if you sit and listen to us, then you'll hear that same information and hopefully you'll be able to understand what's really been going on over the past, I say 50, 60, 70 years, but it's probably more like 100 years. Probably more like 1,000 years.
127-ish.
Yeah, there you go. Okay. I would be willing to go back a little bit further. And that voice you hear there, that's the voice of Corey Hughes. And you can find Corey Hughes at coreyhughes.org. And he's a fantastic researcher. I mean, mind-blowing. I've been looking forward to this one because mine, as most of you listeners will know, my knowledge is about these times back in Harvard in the 50s and 60s and all of these New World Order elites and how the CIA was formed and some of the little stories lingering around there. And of course, you know, I've been building up to researching something in particular, and especially recently with my Black Hand series, I'm leading up to researching what this guy is possibly the top researcher in the world for. So I mean, you have proven yourself, at least to me, and I'm sure our conversation now is going to prove to everybody exactly your credentials and your knowledge on the subject. So, Corey Hughes, can you introduce yourself to this audience?
Sure. My name's Corey Hughes. I'm a historian, and I guess now I can call myself an author, considering I'm about to finish my book.
Congrats.
About 15 chapters. I have the one I'm on now and 2 additional chapters, and I'm done. It's been a long haul. The book itself has been in the works for over a year, but my research began in July of 2018. I mean, technically, I got into history in 2015, and I spent 3 years on World War II and the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. And when you study the Holocaust, it will undoubtedly lead you to the doorsteps of Kennedy. And so when I realized the connection there and made the connection, I was like, I needed to know this my whole life. So let's go, let's do this thing. And I spent literally 3 years nonstop, putting in like 12-hour days, like every day, 7 days a week.
So I killed them. You're telling me you're telling me that before what, about 2018 or is it 2015 that you actually started writing?
No, I started writing a year ago, but I started the research in Kennedy in July 2018.
Right. So you were doing just like video stuff and audio stuff before when you were putting out that sort of stuff.
So I used to work with an anonymous group. We used to run the Anon HQ website. That was like the anonymous website for years. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where I got my start in freelance writing. And I launched the Anonymous podcast. And I basically had gotten my feet wet about 2014. And I had met so many incredible researchers. I was like, well, I was a cop for almost 10 years. I have multiple degrees. I have thousands of hours of training and experience in actual real world investigations. And I was like, I'm going to take on the biggest, I'm going to study all the world's mysteries and figure them all out. And so in 2015, I was really into studying the Holocaust. And like I said, we won't talk about that today, but that led me to Kennedy. And by 2018, I had already pretty much figured out how research worked, or at least I thought I had. Because when you're studying World War II, there's not a lot of dots to connect. There's a lot of information out there, and it's about understanding the totality of what happened. When it comes to Kennedy, there's no information out there on what really happened. It is a whole bunch of dots that are scrambled, and I was like, in 50, 60 years, nobody can figure out who the shooter on the grassy knoll is. I was like, bullshit. So that was my only goal. I needed to know who the shooter on the knoll was. That's it.
And do you think that you got there in the end then?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
I know everything that happened. And I even see the connections to other things that people don't know about, like Israeli sabotage of our nuclear submarines, but specifically the Thresher and the Scorpion. Like, there's no information on those. When I was going through my Kennedy research, I came across what I believe to be another political assassination that no one's ever known or talked about. So yeah, in the course of my first 3 years of studying World War II, I got a grip on how to go about doing research and how to go about finding sources and looking for what I call hooks. Hooks that will certain things. And so
this is really what listening to you is really filling me full of. I mean, I talked about this to a few researchers recently behind the scenes. Like what you were talking about hooks, I probably described as markers, like things that you can tell someone does something, and you can insinuate further because everybody who you pass who have that marker or that certain trait will be doing a certain thing with a certain amount of people, and it's usually naughty, and you can usually find evidence, and you can make assumptions when you're investigating, because those assumptions will lead you to just propel you and motivate you to investigate further, and that investigation further will bring up more information, and you can look at things through different lenses. So I feel really passionate about wanting to teach people how to research. And it's obviously something that you've had experience with. What was it like being trained professionally then to investigate? Is there a massive difference? Do you feel that there's, and I see a dog in the background, a leash being taken off you when you can now investigate things independently?
Well, the comparison I'll make is that like independent researchers who have never actually worked in law enforcement, who have actually put together cases, because that's what you're trying to do. Like with Kennedy, you're trying to make a case, and that's what cops do every single day. And so one of the biggest things that really kind of caught me by surprise was in a police situation. Let's say you have like a home invasion robbery, right? And the victim is killed, and then it turns out that the boyfriend has a red Mustang. Okay. Now, if you think if the boyfriend had something to do with it, you're going to be looking for a witness who might have seen a red Mustang, right? And so then when you find the 4 houses down, you have a witness who saw the red Mustang you're like, okay, as a police officer, that's case closed. The boyfriend was there. The red Mustang was seen. Therefore, they have a direction and they know where to go with the case. But in the Kennedy assassination, like I have a gross disgust for Kennedy researchers in general, because they're generally some of the dumbest people on the fucking planet.
I would say that there will be a lot akin to how I feel about Jack the Researcher rippers as well, going back all the way to the 1800s, even the start of the case. The people right at the start were trying to make something fantastical out of it rather than actually looking at the evidence.
Well, that one was pretty simple. I mean, that was Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. Right?
Oh, I disagree completely. No. I will bring. No. Me and you, we can have a talk about this once I've written up my thesis. I've written a little bit on it already, but I will disagree massively with because you're talking about the butcher.
His DNA was linked to the shawl that was connected to a victim, and it was verified by genetics 100 years later.
I know what's said. I will look forward to speaking about this case because I have many reasons why that is partially right and partially wrong. But I agree completely. The wonderful thing about doing research is that we come to our conclusions through our own evidence, and then, like you say, we're able to build our case. Now, if I come to you, and I'm pretty positive from looking at your work and listening to what you say, that if I come to you with very good evidence, that you may change your mind dependent on the evidence you're given. And I think that's what both our complaints are with other researchers, is that they have their set idea right at the start. People want it to be Jack the Ripper to have been a long mustache twiddling aristocrat connected to the biggest people on the planet. But
from what I can tell, just in the very brief amount of time that I spent on it, it appears as though Kosminski is the guy. They suspected him as being the guy, and he was intentionally protected at the time because ultimately his actions were Jewish ritual murders in as far as the way he removed and cleaned the organs and all that stuff. So if you haven't looked into that angle of it, take a look at that angle. And
I have, and I also know there's another person who we can talk about. Like I say, we are going to have a very good relationship because we can actually talk about these things and we can disagree.
I saw some of your work and I was like, this is going to be my new best friend.
Yeah. Well, the best thing about doing this sort of stuff is that you have to be completely and utterly passionate, because you have to spend a load of time looking through loads of documents and loads of I
spend time on such minutia that the average person would look at and be like, what are you doing? I'm like, I need to know what color her dress was. It's like so stupid that, but
there's been some of the lines in my work have been 2 days of research for a line, just and at the end of it I think, why? But then I know why, because it's about putting every single bit of information out there so that people can see the whole thing. That's at least my approach, rather than selected pieces. So I dig you on that. On the fact that other researchers in these fields tend to be found wanting, and have been found wanting for hundreds of years, to be honest.
Well, and I can tell you, it was specifically in Kennedy, there have been things introduced that were 100% COINTELPRO, monitored by the FBI. I have been kicked out of literally every JFK research forum that there is. The split second I mentioned Israel and their connection through Meyer Lansky and all that stuff, their hair gets set on fire. I get flamed, and then I get banned.
Yeah. Well, it's not as surprised. Can you give some people, because I know loads of I've heard lots of stories. Can you give people an idea of who Meyer Lansky was?
Oh, yeah. In a nutshell, I'll give you the short version and the slightly longer version. In the short version, Meyer Lansky was the boss of all bosses of the mafia of all time.
He's amazing, isn't he? He's just astounding.
People don't understand. He was the man behind the scenes who made the money. He set up the drug trafficking routes. He started Murder Inc. He spoke, and everyone listened. That's how Meyer Lansky operated. His connections were so much deeper than the U.S. Mafia. His connections were directly to Ben-Gurion himself via the Sonborn Institute. I'm sure you're familiar with that, going back to 45 and the large-scale weapons smuggling operations out of the country. So the Mafia created the state of Israel. There would be no state of Israel or any of that shit if it wasn't for the large-scale smuggling operations being done, headed by Meyer Lansky and his U.S. Mafia. Meyer Lansky was the man. There's a couple things that really shocked me. His name is starting to come up in mainstream conversations. There was a movie with Harvey Keitel, Lansky, which was unbelievable because they included a scene in there which was actually not historically accurate, but it represented the meetings between Lansky and Reuven Daphne and the original days of the Haganah, and how they formed the relationships with, Bugsy Siegel and those guys out in LA. And so, it's amazing how much information has come out on Meyer Lansky, but still, you'll never find a document connecting him to the Kennedy assassination, but you don't have to, because he was the man. He was the American point of contact for the Mafia. So,
do you think that push in the media, in movies like Goodfellas and the like, do you think that was a push to kind of make anybody who think about the mob think about Italians?
Well, let's see. Well, let's talk about that in particular. What movie in particular pushed the Sicilian-Italian narrative of the mob? What was the one?
There's a few.
The Godfather was the one. Yeah. Right?
Well, they're free.
At the time of the Godfather's making, the man who oversaw the making of the Godfather also happened to be the head of the Motion Picture Association of America at the time, and was also the man who shot Kennedy from the grassy knoll. And that is the one and only Jack Valente. Jack Valente is the man who basically, you're probably a little younger than I am, but we grew up in the same era. Every single bit of television, movies, anything that came out of Hollywood between 1966 and 2004 had to have the seal of approval of Jack Valente. And Jack Valente was a lifelong CIA agent. He had to have worked for the OSS during World War II. And he was Hollywood's propagandist. He created the motion picture rating system that we all know since we were kids. That was all the work of the CIA, right? So Jack Valenti was rewarded with his role in, basically, he was one of the major orchestrators of the Kennedy assassination. And he was rewarded in 1966. He took over the Motion Picture Association of America. And that was when the MPAA really had its rise, because prior to him, even though there was an MPAA, Hollywood was really run by Lew Wasserman at Universal.
And, I think it might be his grandson. I can't remember if it's his son or his grandson. Casey Wasserman changed his name back to Wasserman and was on Jeffrey Epstein's plane in 2002 or 2003, I think it was, maybe.
Oh yeah, well, see, Epstein, and about Robert Maxwell and all the history of the international sex trade. Well, you could trace that, go back even further. You can trace that to like the Bobby Baker scandal in the 1960s, prior to Lyndon Johnson taking over, right? So that was all going on at the time Kennedy was killed. The Bobby Baker scandal was, again, full swing. And the Bobby Baker scandal, there was one in particular, a Soviet spy who John Kennedy was sleeping with, named Romesh. I always forget her first name. And she was part of Bobby Baker's ring. And then that was about to come out too when Kennedy got killed. And so there was a lot going on with that. But that ring also connected to Carlos Marcello in New Orleans, right? And then Carlos Marcello obviously had an operation that stretched at least to Dallas and Houston, because Jack Ruby was basically running prostitutes and people who were being trafficked between Dallas and Miami back in that day. So, and that connects us to like the Rose Jeremy story and all that stuff.
It's such a massive. You say about the media, and then you say it goes back to like Wasserman and his empire, and a lot of this has obviously this. And this is what we were talking about. Really, is that it does have that Israeli connection, the Jewish mob. I say Israeli connection, but a lot of them, I think, Ashkenazi Jews who set up a lot of the infrastructure underneath America, the mob infrastructure. I did a lot of research about Wexner and a lot of his allies in his rise when I was helping out with Whitney Webb's books. And there was a certain period where their organization level was beyond anything that was anywhere nearby. I mean, their ability to organize and infiltrate organizations was just, it was mob-like. Mm-hmm. And I think that was like, you had so many different levels of these of basically Jewish mafia within this circle. So I'm not surprised. I've always built up to JFK. I've gone back to some of the most beautiful mysteries of the past, and I've just been pulling them apart. And one thing that I now want to ask you from my own work is I look at the creation of something like the German Marshall Fund that I wrote about, and I look at, there's a picture of all of these guys, these New World Order guys. These are John McCloy, these are David Rockefeller, loads of the people who were part of that New World Order, and they all look like gangsters standing outside. They're all CFR members, they're all Council on Foreign Relations members.
Right. Well, you bring up, you mentioned, so that connects McCloy, connects the Marshall Fund to Operation Mockingbird, because that's where a lot of the funding was coming from Mockingbird. So
really, from the Marshall Fund? Oh my Lord, I'm not surprised at all, because that was, they didn't start their training organizations till 1982, and I've been trying to work out and trying to understand what they were doing between 1972 and 1982 that was worth so much money to the German government when they actually set up the GMF. But you see organizations like that, and you see gangsters standing outside. We've got different levels of gangsters, different sets, but when they can all make money, they'll all work together. And is this what the Kennedy assassination was? Like, was it, because the way I seen it was like it manifested because there was a load of different people who said, let's work together. And that working together hadn't properly been done before, or that sort of level. And afterwards, that led to kind of the mafia being infiltrated completely by intelligence, and intelligence just becoming the mafia. That's how I see it. Would you see it the same way or differently?
Close. That's very similar. But really, it goes back to, I'd say, like this. The path that started to lead us to where we are today began in the first 6 months of 1945. And I say that because it was towards the end of 1943 that the fate of Hitler and the National Socialists was kind of done. Like by the end of 43, the war was well on its way to being lost. And the man who was the head of Adolf Hitler's army and the head of his intelligence was Reinhard Gehlen. And so Reinhard Gehlen is by far one of the most important people in history in as far as sculpting the 20th century. So Reinhard Gehlen knew the war was over. And so he ends up in a camp. Well, let me back up. Late 43, he starts to come up with a plan to ensure his own survival. And so he takes all of Germany's intelligence and basically has his men scatter it throughout Europe. Kind of like the rumors of the Nazi gold, right? Scattered all throughout Europe. So, but Reinhard Gehlen actually did this with all of Germany's intelligence. And then when he ends up in a camp in early 45, he presents himself as Reinhard Gehlen. And so Donovan and fucking Alan Dulles are like, whoa.
Donovan and Dulles, of course, are some of the biggest characters in history, especially with
they're the forefathers of American intelligence.
Yeah.
Period. Donovan is the man.
Yeah, Donovan is definitely the man.
These guys are fucking like 33rd degree Freemasons, part of the World Brotherhood, part of P2.
Were they Scottish Rite? Were they that sort of like? I don't understand the Masonry thing, but I don't really
understand it too much either. But I can tell you, 100% of Mason lodges in America were opened by Jews. So. For me, the Masons are a front organization to recruit the Goyim into the Jewish mindset establishment. But let me get back to Reinhard Gehlen. So Reinhard Gehlen cuts a deal with Dulles and Donovan. He goes on to end up forming what's known as the Gehlen organization, which is really like the largest like turnkey spy organization absorbed by the CIA at the end of the war. Some estimate his network was as big as 700,000, and it was mostly centered in the Soviet Union, the spy networks within the Soviet Union, and basically had established it during the war to counter the Soviets after the war, right? So that was kind of like the purpose of him building his network. So basically between 45 and 47, allegedly there's no CIA, there's no OSS, right? So allegedly nothing's going on. But no, that's like the most important 2 years in fucking American intelligence history, because it was those 2 years that Reinhard Gehlen, with Dulles and all these, like literally hundreds of Nazi generals, they funneled over 230,000 Nazis out of Europe and North Africa into South America, right? So when people talk about paperclip, where they took a couple hundred scientists, that's a joke. They funneled a third of the goddamn remaining Nazi army out of out of Europe into South America, right? So that's why like you have such a strong German presence in Argentina.
I've experienced them down in Chile. I was living in Chile for the past 6 months, and there's plenty of German settlements down in the south, and they're very clearly Germans. You know, proper blonde hair, blue eyes, speaking to the accent. That's my terrible racist German accent, and they whenever you see them, they keep themselves to themselves. They just don't talk to anybody else. I think it's like generationally they keep that fear that they're going to be discovered for something in the past.
So Frank, what was his name? Sheehan, the guy who was the lawyer for Watergate with the big blonde. You know what I'm talking about? The white hair. I forget.
Yeah. I think I know who you're talking about. I've read. He was a lawyer for something else as well as Watergate as well. I read something I'm reading.
I met him at a conference in Las Vegas.
Maybe it was the murder of Orlando Letelier. Maybe he was also anyway.
Quite
Sorry, go
possibly,
on.
quite possibly. But I met him and I showed him my Kennedy evidence and stuff. And I can tell you, well, I'm going to get to my point of bringing him up in the first place. But he's a gatekeeper for sure. He has some key documents he confirmed that he has that he won't release that will prove the Kennedy assassination was an inside job, right? So, but anyway, he did fantastic work on the Galen organization, and he tells a story in one of his presentations about a guy named Joseph Berkheimer Smith, who was the #2 guy for the CIA station down in Mexico City in the 1970s, right? And so he tells this long story about how Berkheimer is approached by Mexican FBI, and they tell him that they're going to a plane is going to come and pick him up tomorrow, and he needs to go with them, and they're going to, have some kind of meeting. So Berkheimer gets picked up and he gets flown to Argentina from Mexico City. And he tells the story to Sheehan about being driven in a Jeep, through the mountains. And all of a sudden they're in this like Bavarian village, like in the middle of the jungle. And they walk into this like pub, like German style pub. And there's like a huge, like 30-foot swastika flag, like hanging on the wall.
Yeah.
And they basically sit him down and they basically explain to him how they just set up this guy named Pablo Escobar in Colombia, and they're going to be running this cocaine operation, and they'll be able to make as much money as they need to fight their enemies forever. And so Berkheimer then basically says, well, I can't believe you're trying to recruit me into this. And they basically say to him, oh, we're not trying to recruit you into this. We want to let you know who's doing this. So, watch out, don't cross our path. Right. And so he wasn't destined to stay with the Mexico City office for too much longer after that. But that just goes to show the relationship between the Galen organization, post 45, when he was brought to South America, and the reach that they had, because like the Galen organization was massive. I mean, it ended up in the millions during the Cold War. And if you ask me, the logistics specialist who put together how the actual assassination would go down was probably Reinhard Galen himself.
That's quite. I mean, it's amazing. There was this change in that period. You talk about the importance of the 6 months after the end of World War II, and then the few years afterwards as well. How massively important it is, and people really underestimate what was going on during that period and the attempts to capitalize, because they knew that they were going straight into another war, and they knew that the borders would be set with Russia, and that war was a Cold War, of course, and lots of posturing, but in actual fact it has been a war. It's just been proxy wars all over the place, lots of a kind of economic war, then a policy war, and it's continued to shift and change until now it's almost come back to the same place. And the things I'm hearing now, the rhetoric that I hear, that I've studied in the 1950s, and there's a point in the post World War II era where they just basically took over the universities, and they started really implanting lots of people. So you mentioned that there's links with the GMF. What other sort of university activity do you know about during this period, sort of like just after the World War?
Well, as far as just after the World War, I don't have too much information. I can tell you this much. I'm going to talk a little bit about Jack Valente because it connects to all this stuff. So Jack Valente was the shooter on the knoll. There were actually 2 shooters on the grassy knoll. David Ferry was the first who fired the throat shot. The second shooter was Jack Valente, who I've already said.
David Ferry's an odd-looking fella. I mean,
yeah.
He portrayed quite well in the movie, but I mean, when you
yes.
when you look at him, it's just, wow, that's an odd-looking fella.
So Jack Valente, this will connect to exactly what we're talking about in Harvard and all that stuff. So Jack Valente is born in 1921, September 5th, 1921. And he, by the age of 15, okay, by 1936, he's working as a hall boy for Humble Oil, who is owned by Prescott Bush, George Bush. Jack Valente worked with George de Mohrenschildt. And if you know about Kennedy, one of Oswald's handlers in Dallas, oil man George de Mohrenschildt, he was working for Humble Oil and knew Jack Valenti when Jack Valenti was a teenager. Okay, so that's Jack Valenti's background. He ends up going to the University of Texas in Houston, where midway through, he's still working for Humble Oil. He's with them for like 17 years, and he ends up going off to the war. Okay, this is where things get interesting because his war record is a crock of bullshit. Allegedly, Jack Valenti goes off to the war where he's a Air Force pilot, and he does like 50 bombing missions. But I've torn apart his war record, and none of the companies that he's supposed to have belonged to list him as having belonged to it. So he was not a fucking bombing mission. He lied about all that stuff. He was obviously a trained assassin at that time, and I have some information that would imply he actually worked with the OSS, who were doing some backdoor dealings with the Nazis at the time. This
sounds a lot like I someone who matches this MO in that sort of era and that sort of period, running in the same circles. Tom Corbally. That sounds a bit like who was. Have you ever heard of Tom Corbally?
No.
Oh, you will love learning about Tom Corbally. He's a special one indeed, but very much like that, an assassin. Stories about Tom Corbally he was the guy who stood next to a line of German soldiers, and someone would say, now one of you are going to tell us everything we didn't need to know, and they'd say no, wouldn't say anything, and then Tom Corbally would be the one to execute them, just shoot them in the head, and then that would urge the others on to do it. He was really the guy who did the really dirty stuff. There's also masses of evidence that he supplied a lot of women to JFK. And he's a massively important part of like linking up the British side with the American side. So he spent a lot of time in London as well. So Tom Corbally is one of the most under the radar people. He eventually went on to work for Kroll Associates, if you know.
Oh, Kroll. I know all about them.
Yeah, who does? I mean, anybody who does research like us always ends up at Kroll's door, and you go, that's really a horrible place. Like that's where all of the horrible secrets are. Right, where were we? Sorry, that was really.
All right, so Jack Valenti gets back from the war, and he finishes up his degree at the University of Texas in Houston, and he applies to Harvard Business School. And so he gets rejected because he was a BC student. He is not a great student. And actually, I caught some inconsistencies in his alleged behaviors before he even went to the fucking war. Allegedly, he was working with their football team and he had to miss some school because he was doing some promotion for the school football team. But then in his FBI file, when they went and interviewed that coach, they're like, who are you talking about? I never had any help with this football team. And so he lied about doing stuff with the football team before he even went to the war, right? So he was obviously being groomed and probably passed around from the time he was 15 working at fucking Humble Oil, right? So, anyway, he gets rejected from Harvard Business School. So what does he do? He flies up there. He spends the weekend with the dean. And then he comes home, and then he is all of a sudden, not only is he accepted, he's put into their accelerated honors program. Okay. And so he gets his master's degree at Harvard in 18 months. He's done by 48. And who else was at fucking Harvard in 48?
Well, Kissinger's there.
Henry Kissinger.
Yeah,
Henry Kissinger. Yeah.
There's a few of the really and the people who were around, the people who were taking these people and deciding where they go were people like George McBundy, who of course is massively associated with. He was serving under JFK. I can't remember which position.
And he was also busted having a sexual relationship with Valenti.
Oh, really? Not a surprise. George McBundy. He's got a name. Like, who has a name? No, sorry.
All of those guys were fucking
George
each other.
Bundy. I say it wrong every time because my brain can't register it. Muck George Bundy. Who has a name like Muck George? Who has a name like Muck George? I mean, it's suspicious. But Muck George Bundy is the guy who said to Kissinger, no, don't go to the FBI. Come to the CFR. And a lot of these guys seem to end up going through that route. Like, there's a lot of training, but a lot of it was Harvard. Through that period, the concentration, I mean, the CIA projects were echoed as they happened, as the creation of the CIA happened, and as you had the first coups at the same time. Kissinger's running his Kissinger's International Seminar to train young leaders to put eventually into the roles of these coups. Of course, it doesn't work as fast as they want. It's a much longer term project training young leaders. It turned out. And after 17 years, they get found out. but they had a lot of time doing it, and they were starting to do that. But it's also I take it you've come across what's his name, William Yandell Elliott as well, who's one of the big people. He was Kissinger's mentor. If you're looking for someone who was probably involved, he was an advisor to 6 presidents, I think, including Kennedy, and he's basically the hidden voice of and hand of like this New World Order group. Go on.
Well, the way I see it, this entire push for this New World Order, let's be like very specific on what we're talking about. What we're talking about is a Jewish Zionist push to take over the world. End of story. That's what it is. It traces back to 1897, Theodor Herzl. This is not even like, this isn't even conspiracy. They fucking openly write about this stuff. These people are so arrogant. They, if you go back and read the minutes from the early Zionist Congress, it's ridiculous.
Well, I mean, you see this, there is a counter push at this moment you're talking about, where they're basically expressing what they want, and Truman and people are completely bending to their will. There is a counter push by the people like the American Friends of the Middle East, Kermit Roosevelt Jr.
Plus many of the Orthodox groups.
Gildersleeves and others, they set up groups to be like, no, we have to, basically it was a load of anti-Zionist groups that got made by the people who formed the CIA, some of the main people, and they were over, their opinion was constantly pushed to the side, and they were completely, their fears were completely brushed aside. It seemed like by 1967, then that was like, it peaked, and they knew, all of those people knew that they could no longer even talk about it that much, and they had to just remain low because all of the attacks became like focused at these people who had obviously been what they considered anti-Semites, but were just anti-Zionists, you know.
Right.
They tried to paint. Go on.
Right. But here, but in touching on the anti-Semitism, anti-Zionist conundrum that we have, the problem is, while there's only a very few percentage of the people who are Jewish, who identify as Ashkenazi Jews, are actual real diehard Zionists. The Zionists have done an amazing job over the last 100 years of pulling the average, the orthodoxy and the secular Jews into their cause to support Israel. When you look at polls, 80 to 90% of Ashkenazi Jews have a strong emotional connection to the state of Israel, which is hilarious because that isn't even where the original fucking temple was, right? So when you go back in history, the original temple was most likely in northern Ethiopia, and the original fucking Israelites were about as black as fucking night. Seriously, there was not a white Jew on planet Earth until 740 AD when the Khazars were forced to convert by the Russians. And this, if you ask me, where all the Russian hate comes from throughout history, is because the Russians drove the Khazars out of the land, which is currently now the Donbass region in the Ukraine, right? Which Russia just fucking annexed. So in reality, the true Ashkenazi Jewish homeland being the Ukraine, the Russians just annexed their homeland. That's what this is all about.
Yeah,
that's what this whole fucking war is about. It has nothing to do with none of the other modern political bullshit. It is a 1,000-year-old grudge. I have no doubts whatsoever.
I find the whole fact that you can't talk about this stuff, of course, so contrived because they need to create this so they can continue on the path of what they think is the right path. And I read this article. I can't remember who it was by. It's so annoying. And I'm not into genetics. I'm quite opposite to like how they manipulate genetic research nowadays. I don't trust genetic research in the hands of the geneticists of today. But I won't give my codes over, my genetic code over to them willingly. But still, I see positive sides in things like the 23andMe, where you can have your DNA tested. And this one Jewish author commentator who was quite big, I think he wrote for the New York Times, and he did a test, and he just stopped being a Zionist afterwards. He was like, it's nowhere near related to me. No one I know I've ever been related to actually comes from any of those areas or ever did any of those things, and I live in someone else's dream. And it was really amazing to hear how just given a different perspective, and I think genetic perspective is a completely, most of the people in my country, in Britain, do not know what genetics they are. They think they're British. The Welsh think they're Welsh, and the Scottish think they're Scottish, and the English think they're English. And in actual fact, the English is broken up into about 10, maybe 12 different tribal ethnic origins. Wales is 5 different ethnic origins, like the heliotypes, like separate from each other, come from separate areas, separate tribes that didn't intermarry with each other because natural borders still remained over time. That's what's amazing. West Wales, you got Southwest Wales and Northwest Wales are 2 different genetics, and even though they were next to each other, they remained 2 separate genetics for over 1,000 years for sure, because they just didn't find each other. You're not the same as me, and they feel a bit like that. Now, if you I find what you were talking about as well with the smuggling rings, the Israeli smuggling rings that were happening just post World War II. Now, you read the piece I did about Stanley Setti and the murder of Stanley Setti, and he was actually supposedly a smuggler, helping with this trade, smuggling guns and arms across and cars across from France to either Israel or to Britain. I think they'd bring them to Britain. He'd run them through a garage, make them legit, and then they'd send them back with guns in them and send them up to Israel. And that seems to be lots of the where the money is made by gangsters is whatever job comes around at the time. Right. And post World War II, there was loads of guns everywhere, and it was obvious that people, because I've done a lot of research which I haven't released yet, which I'm looking forward to releasing, about Nahum Goldman, Guido Goldman, who set up the German Marshall Fund. His father's Nahum Goldman, who was one of the real founding fathers, one of the many founding fathers.
He was a horrible fucking human being.
I know. Oh man, this is fantastic. I mean, I think I put it in the GMF article if I can find it to quote soon. But there's a fantastic piece about him. His life is just extraordinary, because at one point I think about 1917, around that time, he's working for German intelligence. It goes round in a big circle. He claims to be fleeing from persecution, but they were living in Switzerland and they had lots of support. And he was just like one of the heads of Zionism, one of the people who made it happen, who created it. And what he did to manipulate people and make everything work his way is quite extraordinary.
When you go through like the original Zionist text, like the Diary of Herzl, you come to realize they don't really give a shit about non-Zionists. If you're a Jew and you're not a Zionist, you're just might as well be fucking ground into dust like everyone else.
Yeah.
And when you get into what really happened during the Holocaust, and you come to realize there were no gas chambers, there was no plan to kill all the Jews, and there weren't even 6 million goddamn Jews living in Europe at the time. The whole Holocaust story is bullshit. Mm-hmm. When you come to understand how the Zionists in particular manipulated the story for their own political gain, it really becomes disgusting. Like the 6 million number in particular came from the Talmud, and it was said that in order for the Moshiach, the Messiah, to return, 6 million of God's chosen people must vanish. Mm-hmm. Right. So they manipulated the story to match the biblical texts as prophecy. Right. And so that's where a lot of these stories came from. And when you start to get into some of these people, some of these early Zionist leaders, I mean, people don't understand what happened in the concentration camps. So like the concentration camps, when the Allies destroyed the means of production, they were no longer able to get supplies into the camps. The Germans actually turned to the Red Cross and even Jewish organizations to provide aid to the camps. And it was the Jewish agency, particularly the Jewish agency in Switzerland, shut down all of these other aid organizations and prevented them from sending aid to the camps. It even went as far as to say that the transport of the Jews to Auschwitz was an opportunity, because some of them didn't have to walk because they were put on trains. I mean, like some of the statements made by these fucking Zionists, they needed Jews to die, because only then could they go to the world and say, see, Jews died, we need our own country. That was the entire thing.
that will come across in the article I'm writing about Nahum Goldman in his own words over and over and over again. They said, they insinuated, and then by about 1937, 1938, they were saying it out loud. They were saying what we need to do, and they needed to. There was this weird moment where they were working with each other, like the British and the Zionists were working with each other over Israel. All the other times they were against each other. They were on opposite sides. Britain wasn't hoping to give up that land at all to anybody, and they kind of like fought against it politically behind the scenes. I want to just this is from a book, The Seventh Million, The Israelis and the Holocaust, by Tom Segev. And this describes Nahum Goldman, and I just want I think it's worth stating. When the Israeli and Jewish representatives walked out of the formal negotiations, Nahum Goldman's great hour as a lobbyist and manipulator began. Goldman organized and coordinated a worldwide network of activity aimed at persuading the Germans that it was in their best interest to reach an agreement. As part of this effort, he monitored and even took part in the ceaseless haggling in Bonn. He went to see cabinet ministers, senior officials, and members of parliament, making his way through the corridors of power and into the inner chambers. He saw everything and heard everything. He plotted intrigues. He shared secrets with supporters, thwarted opponents, collected promises, made threats, a man of 1,000 faces. Amazing. He gets given after World War II and the creation of the UN, of which Eleanor Roosevelt was a big part of as well. He was given an office within the UN to plan basically the creation of the state of Israel. So the plans all in there. And one thing that other people don't understand about these extremely important Zionist leaders who were behind the creation of Israel, they were behind the creation of American politicians straight away. And that includes Kissinger, because a young Kissinger would have gone round Nahum Goldman's house on occasions, and that's because his mum, Paula Kissinger, was Nahum Goldman's housemaid, making sure everything was kosher for when guests come round, that the cooks all remained to make sure everything was done in a kosher manner. So there's that young Kissinger got his opportunities. Why? Because he's got connections in the right places, and he gets lifted up and he gets boosted, and he can do whatever he likes, and then it gets rewarded, so he does whatever he likes. And that's what we saw the rest of politics unravel. Lots of these people who were involved with these Zionist leaders were some of the most important people around, and of course some of the most crooked as well. The Bronfman family were around Nahum Goldman's house quite a lot, Seagram's family, and yeah, I just thought I'd add to that, just add a little bit to that. So you do a lot of research into not only Kennedy, but into the creation of Zionism, because that's where it's led you. And
right, so
where was
focus,
go on?
My focus is really like what I consider technically 1895, starting with like the Dreyfus Affair and stretching through 68 with Robert Kennedy. Like, that's my focus. I don't give a shit about anything after 68 unless it pulls me to my focus research, right? Because there's just so much. Like, by 68, we already know the deal, right? So like our country was taken over. Kennedy was killed by the Zionists and the Zionist establishment. See, it's bigger than just Israel, because it includes like the Jewish Agency, AIPAC, back in the day, the American Zionist Council, and all the different Zionist organizations. So I refer to it as the global Jewish establishment, because that's what it is. It's bigger than Israel.
And some of them did. We're not saying that all across the board, every organization just bent over to Zionism straight away. There were lots of Jewish organizations over the 10 years post World War II who really fought against sort of Zionist principles being introduced as just wholly Jewish principles.
Absolutely. That resistance is all but gone today. Like, virtually every Jewish organization is a Zionist organization.
Yeah, post 67 world. I think that's you've hit a nail on the head with me, because I when I was doing my Schwab research, everything before 68 seems like they're creating the New World Order, and everything
Right.
after 68 seems like they're enacting the New World Order.
100%. And that's exactly why I kind of limit myself, because the jig is up by 68. By 68, it's done. The Zionists are in control. After Kennedy, they felt so emboldened. I mean, like, if you go on Wikipedia right now and look up Israeli assassinations, there's a list of like 250 of them, right?
Yeah.
Like, so they just went nuts. They're like, oh my God, we did it. I mean, America's ours.
I'd say hog wild, but that wouldn't be kosher. Sorry, little pun there.
But yeah, so let's take a look what happens when Kennedy gets killed. So the man that they had been grooming since the beginning, who never won a fair election in his life, Lyndon Johnson, becomes the president. Lyndon Johnson is the third Jewish president. He's the first Jewish Zionist. The previous Jewish presidents were Hamilton and Lincoln. So
did Johnson know that he was going to become president on the day? Like,
I don't think so.
I don't think so either, and that's why I was asking. Is really interesting, because I think he looks shell shocked, and I think the whole thing is like he knows what he looks like the days afterwards seems to be like everything that he had kind of like worried about in the distance suddenly happened in front of him, and he knew every single person who was involved in making that happen.
You just nailed it, man. Man, you just fucking nailed it on the head. He knew as soon as it happened, he knew what happened. But he didn't know until that moment, because you don't want to keep the guy who's going to be the next president in that loop, because he can always be questioned on it.
Yeah.
And if he doesn't know shit, he can't. End of story. That simple. Plausible deniability is the name of the game.
It's cringeworthy. It's cringeworthy. I mean, he gets over. He's obviously like not expecting it at all, but it's cringeworthy to watch that time and his look on his face. And he's. I think it's on the plane where he gets a wink from one of the guys, like yeah. Yes.
So the thing with Johnson is they've been grooming him since the beginning. The guy genuinely never won an election in his life. Every election was stolen. He was their plant from the beginning, and you got to ask yourself why. He was raised Jewish. His mother was a Jew, and just because he never clung to that as an identity, I mean, that's nothing new. You got like Ron DeSantis is as Jew as it gets. And but he'll never cling to that. He was raised by a Jewish woman. He was raised Jewish. And by the time he goes off to college, he forgets about it because he knows he's going to end up in politics. And they never push their people because they already have everyone. So you'll notice they'll never push for a Jewish president because they own every president as it is.
Yeah. So, there's really no point, and the halls of power are not as complex as we think they are. They can be manipulated, and by the time that Kennedy gets into power, they already are being manipulated. I'd be interested to also ask about that time. The moment Kennedy gets in, this is interesting to me for future research as well, because of course I've gone through the Black Hand series, which looks at all of the kind of background of the people who were involved in the Perfumo affair, but from different angles, and looking at the characters who aren't talked about and things that happened in the past that led up to it. A series of suspicious deaths within the nightclub scene that was being taken over by intelligence and mobsters in London. The most highest echelons of power were all focused in these nightclubs in these three parts of London. They were all there all of the time, and it's where all the spy games started going on. And of course, one of them is Mariella Novotny, who when after the election, she's flown over to the States by Harry Alan Towers, who gets her in Kennedy's bedchamber, and then she gets caught. She gets taken to juvenile court, and then the CIA and FBI smuggle her out of the country. And it's kind of like a warning shot, I think, to Kennedy, to say, you've got to play ball now. You've just won the election. What do you know about the women around that time, and what was the difference between? I mean, you must have done research about Kennedy's life itself. So
some, not a whole lot. And as far as setting the stage for the animosity for Kennedy, as he was running, Joe Kennedy was he was a shitbag. Let's be honest. Joe Kennedy was not a good person. He was a bootlegger. He worked with the mob, all this stuff, right? He was a wheeler dealer. He had gone to everybody who he thought he could get money from and made promises, and they got a lot of money, which funded Kennedy's campaign. He made promises to the Zionists, he made some promises as far as benefits for Israel, as far as things he was going to do for Israel, all this stuff. And Kennedy even had to have a meeting and face-to-face agree that he was going to be a promoter of the state of Israel. And then he got money. I forget who the money was funneled through, but that happened. And then what does he do when he gets in office? Immediately, he starts demanding information on Dimona.
Mm-hmm.
Because when
can you explain what Dimona is to me and others?
So, Dimona is a nuclear reactor in the Negev desert, right? So it is basically starting in, this connects to NUMEC and all that other stuff. So going back to like 1956, Zalman Shapiro, a Jew from Philadelphia, opens up the Nuclear Materials and Equipment Corporation, NUMEC, in Apollo, Pennsylvania. There he gets a contract with the U.S. Navy to enrich uranium. Right. And so the U.S. Navy has a very specific standard. It's the highest enrichment of uranium in the world at 97.7% enriched. And it's the only use in the world. It's considered a signature, right? 97.7% is the U.S. Navy signature for the radiation that they use, right? For the uranium that they use. Starting in 1956 through about 1965, maybe a little bit after, Zalman Shapiro and his organization start to funnel upwards of 600 pounds of enriched uranium to the Israelis for use at the Dimona nuclear reactor. Okay, so at the time Kennedy was killed, not only did he know about Ben Gurion and Rudolph Sonborn and the entire smuggling operation that had been going on and continued to go on for 20 years. So let me sidetrack here for a moment. David Ferry, Sergio Arcacha Smith, Gordon Novell, Leighton Martins, his little crew of anti-Castro Cubans, which is a whole nother distraction in the Kennedy assassination. They break into the bunker at Houma, Louisiana, run by the Schlumberger Corporation, which is really run by Jean de Menil, part of Permindex, definitely CIA operation going on all around there. So basically, Gordon Novell ends up saying that the CIA left the door open for them. So they go in, they clear out this bunker full of arms and ammunition. All of that stuff is supposed to be getting funneled to the anti-Castro Cubans for to overthrow them at the Bay of Pigs, right? However, the problem is the incident at Houma took place 8 months after the Bay of Pigs, right? So that money was not going to, the weapons were not going to anti-Castro Cubans. Then when you look into David Ferry and his guys, they actually committed 2 other burglaries of arms depots run by the CIA leading up to that one at Houma. And so none of those, then you start to dig into like what happened to those arms and ammunition. You come to realize that none of those arms or ammunition went to the anti-Castro Cubans because they didn't give a shit about Cuba. Cuba is a front to distract you from the fact that all those arms and the money and all that stuff was sold to Inter Armco in Virginia, run by Samuel Cummings, another CIA agent, and sold to Israel to fight the Palestinians. Okay, that's why there was never a Cuban uprising. That's why the fucking Cubans never had their day.
So David Ferry and the people who were working with them knew that they weren't supporting the Cubans as well.
I don't think they knew anything. They're foot soldiers.
Of course, they're just transporting it to somewhere and then it goes off and then, yeah. Correct.
And all that stuff got funneled through Bannister's office in New Orleans. The same office that Lee Harvey Oswald was alleged to have been at and associated with, which I will bet my left pinky, Oswald was not associated with any of these people.
Yeah.
Starting in January of 1960, Oswald was being impersonated by multiple people everywhere from Miami to fucking Dallas to,
it's extraordinary,
to Virginia,
isn't it?
to Quebec.
Wow. So from 3 years before, they were already running an operation to impersonate him all over the place, knowing that he was going to be their eventual patsy.
No, I don't think they were planning on using him as the patsy until at least early 63. I think that setting him up, what they were doing was they were establishing a persona. They were establishing a legend. They were creating this angry, dissident, communist persona that after he got back from the Soviet Union, because that was disappointing in the official story, then they could pivot that and send him to Cuba, right? So that, I believe, was what they were doing. And hence, when they faked his trip to Mexico City, they say he went to Mexico City to try to get into Cuba. He never went to Mexico City, okay? He was still in New Orleans. Right on that day. I can prove he was still in New Orleans on the day he was alleged to have crossed into Mexico City. So what happened with me was like I said, this started with needing to know who the shooter on the knoll was. That was it. And that is such a naive thing to want to know, or it's ultimately it is irrelevant, and ultimately it's the most important thing in the world simultaneously. It makes me feel like the old Buddhist teachings.
And it'll only open up more questions.
Yes. And so, where was I? So David Ferrie, I traced David Ferrie's interaction with the CIA going back to 1947. There are witnesses who saw him with Clay Shaw from New Orleans in 1947 at where? In a small airport in Venice, Florida. Does that start to ring a bell? A small airport in Venice, Florida. Where have we heard about that before? Maybe some of the 9/11 hijackers were trained at this Venice, Florida airport, right? So Clay Shaw was the leasee of this airport in 1947. That 60 years later or 50 years later, the 9/11 hijackers used. It was a CIA front airport, right? David Ferrie was witness with him back then, which means David Ferrie's relationship with the CIA goes back to 47, which makes sense. Nobody really knows what David Ferrie was doing during the war. There's a big gray area there. Some people say that he was being used by the OSS to do some kind of illicit flying operations, but who the hell really knows? Nobody really knows.
That sounds a lot like Horace Dibbin, Hod Dibbin, who was Mary Ellen Novotny's husband. While she was caught in JFK's bedchamber, and helped with the smuggling back out and meeting her. He was known as a squadron leader, or said to have been a squadron leader in World War II, but he was a pilot, whatever. It's not really sure what he ever did. Later on, he was trying to do psychological operations to completely convince people of satanic panic, and claimed that he was literally in the newspaper writes articles about how he was inducted into a satanic brotherhood in the Isle in the town of Twat in the Orkney Isles, while serving in a Twat with 3 T's in the Orkney Isles during 1941, 1942, and of course this is sort of like seeding out, but what he was really doing, no one really can understand. Right. Now, understanding about the OSS is pretty important as well, because I've done research about what one person who was known as the only British member of the OSS, Ivor Bryce, who later goes on to help write James Bond, and also run a fair few operations with Ian Fleming, or similar operations out in the islands out there.
The British were fucking dastardly with their propaganda.
Weren't they just? I mean,
oh my God.
They were
the political warfare executive was run by Preston Belmar, I think was his name. Holy shit. You look into that guy, he was
it sounds like all the BSC stuff that was run out of New York, because the British were focused in on making the Americans focus on Soviet issues, and they went through so many, like they went round the mulberry bush, as we say. They one of the operations Ivor Bryce planned, he literally planned it all out and enacted it, and it led to the initial policy that looked negatively upon Cuba, was to have a Nazi general turn up in Spain, or Nazi someone or other turn up in Spain with a handcuffed briefcase that gave a fake map showing all of the positions in Cuba where they were going to build Nazi bases. That was one of the ones they did during the war, and it worked as well. It led to them passing a certain act that started the negative downhill. But afterwards, they were focused on making America think that communism was on Cuba Cuba to the point where they made Cuba communist. Really, I mean, they people push people to these extremes. So have you got any nice stories about the OSS and how dastardly they were?
Yeah. So one of the things that really struck me when I did my research on this, and I made a documentary on this a couple of years ago, on the psychological warfare aspect of World War II and the Holocaust, because when you go back to the original documents from the OSS, which technically by date were from the OCI, the Office of the Coordinator of Information, which was what it was until in May 42, May-ish, they became the Office of Strategic Services. In those early documents, some of the best stuff ever, like the doctrine regarding rumors, like written by R.H. Knapp, explains the playbook on how to craft a rumor and what the purpose of a rumor is, and and I'm like, holy shit! And the thing is that the
playbook I can just remember your thought there, but I know what a rumor is. It's a mixture between a rhino and a puma. I learned this at school. Sorry, go on.
So, but yeah, so the early OSS documents really outline a lot of this stuff. And one of the more stunning ones that I found is in a OSS document called some commentary on the domestic and military situation in Germany. And it's from May of 42. May of 42, the documents from May of 42 were pivotal because that was when they were transitioning the name and the role of the OSS. Mm-hmm. But it clearly states, it's an internal document, and it clearly states for them to pay close attention and study to the foreign comments on the use of poison gas. So here we have in May of 42, the seeds of what would grow into the stories of the Nazi gas chambers. In the documents, 2.5 years, 30 months before they would announce that there were ever any death camps. Okay, so if you go back and you read the propaganda, they're contradicting themselves like crazy. By 1943, if you add up all the deaths, it's like 100 million Jews got killed. It's hilarious when you go back and you actually read through it.
To make people understand the process of how you pump propaganda out like that, Alan Dulles was actually located in that period in Switzerland. And it's rumored that his house, I think it was in Bern, had and offices had people but from both sides going in and out all of the time. Nazis were going in and allies were going in, and they'd all be passing around information, and then they'd be going off and doing their work. So there was this amazing ground level operation to infiltrate. I mean, both sides had it as well. And what I found very interesting when you were talking about Red Cross earlier and stuff, and the other sort of charities, humanitarian organizations. Well, when I did my Schwab research into his father's Nazi past, and in a model Nazi company and the atomic bomb effort that they were doing there, so that they could create those heavy water turbines to enrich uranium, they had to make sure that the Ravensburg factory of Escher Weiss wasn't hit during the war. So they got the Red Cross, Swiss Red Cross, to say that it was a place where the center of humanitarian efforts would be. And so it was the only place in Germany that was agreed by the Allies that they wouldn't hit this humanitarian hub. In actual fact, it was the Allies knew fully well that it wasn't going to be a humanitarian hub, but they allow these things to happen so they can infiltrate these areas and see if they can steal any information. So the bad thing we're meant to prevent is the exact thing that strategically in these situations become the focus of attention. It's quite amazing how it works.
So after my Kennedy book, I focus on, it'll be out probably 3 months tops. I'm about to finish it. But I realized it was just too much for me to put all to one book. So I really decided to just focus on the shooters and the multiple Oswalds. And that's it. And but I am extremely passionate about World War II and truth in history in general, because I can tell you right now, the Holocaust has been the biggest lie of all time until COVID-19. And then COVID-19 fucking takes the cake by like a mile. But
it's amazing, isn't it, what they've done?
It's totally amazing. But like up until, and it was funny because it was like, I was like just doing my research.
It is a repeat of history. What you're marking up, those are a repeat of history.
Right.
is seeding fear, a psychological presence for the next like 2 generations to follow them forever.
But the amount of misinformation that people believe about World War II and the Nazis is just so fucking egregious and unbelievable that like, just for history's sake, the record needs to be set straight. And so my next book will most certainly be a massive book that covers basically the origins of Zionism through the end of World War II and like what really went on. Because when you come to understand that there weren't any gas chambers, and what the OSS actually did was they knew exactly what was in each of the camps that they could exploit as a deadly weapon when it wasn't. Like at Treblinka, it's funny because if you look in the history books now, it'll tell you people got gassed with diesel engines at Treblinka. But there is no mention of gas chambers at Treblinka ever throughout the Nuremberg trials at all. At Treblinka, it was accused that they steamed people to death. And so why would they make that accusation? Because at Treblinka, they didn't have Zyklon B delousing facilities. They had steam delousing facilities. And the Allies knew that. So the story all throughout Nuremberg is that at Treblinka, they steamed people to death, right? And when they're talking about this at Nuremberg, they're not talking about Jews at all. They're talking about people. The Jewish twist to the story didn't come until Raoul Hilberg in the 1960s. So like you have this incredible era of history from 1945 till about 1965. Well, you're not going to find a damn history book that talks about the suffering of Jews, gas chambers, none of that stuff. It's a void in history. Mm-hmm. And then Raoul Hilberg wrote his book where the claims that he makes and the claims that people like Jean-Claude Pressac, who wrote the book Technique and Operations of the Gas Chamber, like they just made shit up out of thin air. Like literally, there's 3 or 4 authors who actually just all they do is reference each other in this big circle jerk of fake history from that era of like 1945 through the 60s.
Mm-hmm. I can completely believe that because I've seen how history works and I've seen how our understanding of it is manipulated. I remember being to this certain when I started researching the sort of that era, when I started researching gas chambers, things like that, what the most legitimate, the one with the best credentials was a story about a van that when at the start they were driving around a van with the exhaust hooked up into some sort of unit, and it was said to be used for gassing people or trying to attempt to do that.
Right.
But the actual process had caused people to be so violently sick, the people who were involved in that process in this sort of stuff, violently sick, and the local area to not be happy with them at all doing this, and the screams that used to come out of the thing. Now is that and I'm not asking you to talk about specific. Right. Is that something?
Well, I know
that
the
is
specifics of the gas vans.
Right. So is that a true? Were they looking? Is that what spawned the use of the rumor on the other side as a propaganda effort, or is it that they were actually doing something like that, or is it that nothing like that happened at all?
Right. Nothing like that happened at all, and I'll explain it in excruciating detail. So they were putting out all these numbers, like 1 million Jews killed in Czechoslovakia, and like 1.5 million Jews killed in Poland. And like all these numbers were just so fucking massive. And they're saying that they're getting killed in the camps, but these camps couldn't hold a fraction of a percent of the numbers that they said that they were killing in the camps, right? They're just making these numbers up out of nowhere, right? But a camp could hold 50,000 people, and they're saying 1 million people got killed there. It didn't make any sense. So they crafted the story of the mobile gas chambers, and not only the mobile gas chambers, the other key aspect of the story is the mobile bone grinders. And you need the mobile bone grinders to go hand in hand with the gas vans, because then they could justify the numbers. They just rode through 100 miles and gassed everybody and ground their bones into dust, so there's no evidence. Like, here's the deal. Anytime someone ever says the Nazis destroyed the evidence, what they're saying is they don't have any fucking evidence. It's the same thing.
I have a problem. I have a problem with everything, and this is why I set up NEWSPASTE in the first place, and this is what I want to go on with. I have a problem with anything where people say there's this thing happened, but you're not allowed to talk about it. That anything at all where someone says or acts in a way that means that I have to be quiet makes me instantly think that I'm being deceived, because it's one of the key markers to deceit is being told you're not allowed to speak about something. It's also abusive, and it's something that I've, from lots of study, worked out the behavioral insight teams and psychological operations, as they used to be called.
C.D. Jackson and Robert McClure and R.H. Knapp and all those guys from the early days of World War II.
Yeah, and the first coups in Egypt and Iran that the CIA did, and these guys are nefarious guys, and they've got reasons why they hide everything. But there's there's going to be a load of people who listen to this, and the reaction.
One thing that needs to be clarified. This needs to be clarified. So to put everything in perspective, there is zero argument from anyone at any of the Holocaust museums anywhere. The buildings they present to you as gas chambers are fakes. They are fakes. They were built in 1947 after a coordinated effort between the Russian propaganda unit and the budding CIA. They made the decision. In 1947, the building that was found and is presented as a gas chamber at Auschwitz I was originally built as a morgue and a crematory. And we know this because it had individual rooms, concrete rooms, and it was built into the side of a hill to keep it cool, because you need bodies to stay cold so they don't stink. And why do you have to have a morgue and a crematory on a camp like this? Because there's a war going on and people are dying, right? So it's not because they were gassing people and they needed to burn the bodies. Every single camp, and there were like 75,000 camps across Europe, every single one of them had a crematory, and they had to dispose of the bodies, right? So
how many camps did you say were around Europe?
Like upwards of like 75,000.
75,000.
Well, here you'll have like Auschwitz, which will be like one camp, which really Auschwitz was like 6 camps, and then surrounding Auschwitz you had like another dozen tiny outshoots. So like that includes all of those. So that's kind of the structure. So like Auschwitz might be 25 camps. You know what I mean? So it's kind of.
So how many people died then?
Nobody knows. But I can tell you one thing. When you look at the numbers that everyone uses for reference, they use like census data going back to like 1930 that showed that 9.6 million Jews were living in Europe at the time. And so at the end of the war, there were 3.6 million Jews. So they say, obviously, he killed 6 million Jews. That's where they come up with this bullshit number. However, it completely ignores the fact that by 1942, 2 million Jews fled from Europe to the Soviet Union. Another million fled between North and South America. 300,000 went to Australia, right? When you deduct all the numbers, it comes down to somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5 million potential deaths, which isn't really a gross exaggeration. I'd say the actual number of Jews killed as part, and this is very specific, killed as part of the concentration camp system in Europe, right? The Holocaust has 3 very specific aspects to it. Number 1, a very clear and distinct plan by the German government to eliminate all the Jews. Like it was a specific state-sponsored program. That's one alleged aspect of it. The other one is that there were 6 million Jews who got killed. And the third aspect is that they killed them in gas chambers. Those 3 aspects comprise the Holocaust story, and all 3 are blatantly false. So what is the Holocaust if there were no gas chambers? Well, what you have is a brutal slave labor system that Jews made up somewhere between 30 and 45% of the camps. They were not even the majority in any, well, in some camps they were because of location, but overall they made up less than half of the camps. The majority of the people in the camps were foreign political prisoners. The Germans killed over 1 million gypsies, about 1.25 million gypsies. That's more than the Jews they killed. Okay, so like it's a hijacking of history. It's a rewriting of history, and why it really didn't even have anything to do with getting the state of Israel. Those stories were rewritten later, right? We need to get Israel so Jews will be safe. No, they've been trying to get a state of Israel for, since 1897 at that first Zionist Congress, which was the entire point of the Zionist Congress, was to get a state. But see, if you read some of these quotes from these early Zionists, and I know we're bouncing around here, but it's all connected. So the quotes of these early Zionists, they will go to show there was far more of an agenda going on than getting a state. And they didn't give a damn about Jews. And you know that from reading the diaries of Herzl, how they were willing to literally kill Jews to get their own Zionist state. So the entire state of Israel is just really a political. It's a bunch of white people who are origined in the Ukraine who hijacked land from a bunch of brown people for political and resource needs. That's basically it. It's fucking par for the course, it seems, when you come to understand who's really doing it. So,
wow.
But I go off on tangents sometimes, but all this stuff is like, it doesn't matter what we're talking about. It's all the same story. It's all the same interconnectivity and all the same literal people between this era of like 1930s and like 1960s. Literally the same people.
Yeah.
So I'll talk about the Israelis going back to the 20s and 30s because it's the same people, even though there wasn't technically a state of Israel,
Yeah, most definitely. I understand that from doing my own research and discovering that they were people like Nahum Goldman were traveling around all of Eastern Europe before the war, and they were raising fear and raising fear and raising fear. And by the time the war broke out, I still see them as death camps, but I don't know how they were killed. I don't see them as I don't see the number being anywhere near 6 million. And what I see is horrific work camps that would have been horrible to be in and would have been torturous experience, and lots of people would have died. And if you got sick in those camps, they would have probably given you an injection to say goodnight as well.
Actually, if you research the medical aspect of like particularly Auschwitz, like there were like 3,000 babies delivered there, right? So people would be taken off of work and put into they were treated like, here's the thing, you have to think, this is not a bunch of animals as we've been taught to believe the Nazis were. They were an extremely strict military styled outfit, right? So like there were rules and standard operating procedures and general orders, and there was discipline. Like it wasn't like a lawless land. Like if you stepped out of line, you were disciplined. They fucking executed their own people. Ilsa Koch is like the best example of that. Ilsa Koch, the grandmother or the aunt or whatever of the Koch brothers, right? So she's called the Bitch of Buchenwald. And the story was that she had inmates killed and had their skin cut off to make lampshades out of. That's like still the story. That's still the fucking story. The lampshade story has been debunked since the 90s. Okay?
All stories get debunked eventually, I think. Eventually no one's around to tell them. This is a wonderfully dangerous conversation, just the type that I like, because there'll be a load of people who get really emotive, and there'll be a load of people who already completely and utterly despise anything that me and you do anyway, who will be like, I've been taught something and I believe it with a passion, regardless of the evidence. For me, I think there was a load of people killed in camps, but I agree that the rest of it makes no sense, and the big gap and the not being able to ask questions and all of that leads me to believe that it's something that needs to be debunked eventually, or at least the truth needs to be told for at least the people who were involved in it, because it's disrespectful to add in a load of deaths onto things to make it seem worse. It's bad enough. World War II was an awful affair, a really awful affair that saw lots of people needlessly die. World War One is even more brutal.
I think all the numbers are exaggerated, though. I've seen some people say like 60 million were killed in World War II, and I've seen like other historians say, well, we have evidence for about 25 to 30, but like those other claims we don't have evidence.
By the sounds of it, I would say that the worst front was definitely Russia, and the Russians got the biggest number killed of their own troops, who just like the Nazis just tried to destroy it, and it was very like it was lots of reasons why, historic ones. It's a very strange thing we're talking about here, because we're talking we start off on the death of Kennedy and the assassination of JFK. It's amazing that
it's an intricately linked story, because the Zionists play an intimate role in the shaping of the events of World War II, right? Because ultimately, who was Hitler fighting? hey, I know America was part of the Allies, right? And we're the good guys, but ultimately Hitler was fighting a combination of Zionist and communist forces, the communists from the Russians and the Zionists from the West, right? Mm-hmm. And so like what happened in World War II and the relationships in World War II between the governments completely connects to Kennedy. And then it completely connects to what's going on today, particularly with things like this transgender movement that's being pushed, intentionally pushed, as a method of undermining our culture through sexual deviancy. And we know this because this is what created Hitler in the first place.
Yeah.
Go back to post-World War I Germany and look at how the communists and things like the Frankfurt Institute, funded by Zionists, by the way, were intentionally trying to destroy the fabric of Germany. And that is what created the overt anti-Semitism that came from the National Socialists. When they were done with Jews infiltrating and over trying to break up their society from within. And that is exactly what we're seeing today. Go and trace who's pushing the transgender movement and all this bullshit that we're seeing. Hell, even things like Common Core math were meant to undermine traditional mathematics, right? So this is all being pushed by Zionist organizations like the Aspen Institute and you name it. And they're all the ones behind it because they're doing the same thing to America that they did to Germany in 1918 through 1933. But guess what happened in 1933? Adolf Hitler came and he put a stop to all of that. And then they had to create the myth of Hitler, of the madman Hitler, the meth addict. Well, that was actually true, but all the horrible things that they say about the Nazis, they needed to so you could never understand what Hitler was mad about in the first place because they're doing it again to us today.
Well, one of the things that Hitler did was he stopped the money and the money that they deemed as illegal from leaving leaving Germany domestically. And Alan Dulles and others were actually pre-World War II were in court in Germany trying to get money back that had been confiscated from them. And when that failed, of course, well, that's not going to be good. There's a couple of things from what you said.
Well, one thing I want to comment real quick, and it's hilarious that like 20 years ago, Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor who survives from 6 gas chambers, that guy, he said that there were about 100,000 Holocaust survivors left. Today, there's over 400,000. So where did these extra 300,000 come from in the last 20 fucking years?
Well, they've been breeding. 70-year-old people can still have children.
Hilarious.
That's the world we live in nowadays. I wouldn't believe if you start saying that I'm a 70-year-old and I have my baby in my belly. I identify as a pregnant person.
But I want to know what their excuse is going to be 20 years from now when they're technically like 110 years old.
There's a couple of that they're robotic Kissingers. I wouldn't be surprised if that's what they are by that time. There's a couple of things about what you just were saying there. The reason, if you were to be, and I think this is the best way I'm thinking it in my head, if you were to be a guy who closed his eyes for 10 years in 1929 in anywhere in Europe, and you close your eyes, you could be assured, if you had the knowledge, that some big technology was coming and they were understanding it, and they'd already started to realize that this thing was going to be really big and it could cause massive explosions and etc. That if you closed your eyes in 1929 and opened them up again in 1939, there would be a war. No matter who was fighting against who, where it was going on, there would be a war. And it would be a war to try and get on top of a technology that was definitely on its way, and they were already starting to work on, and they realized how big it was, and they had been given... I can't remember... when like Einstein was working on such things, but it's well before that. It's a good 20 years before, and they knew where it was heading. So I feel that the entering into the atomic age, they knew what was going on at the time, and it did not matter the reasons. There was always going to be an excuse for war between the major powers who had to try and get to this technology first so they could be in control for the next 50, 60, 70 years, which is what we've seen with America, really.
Well, I can see that as being a thought in their head.
Yeah.
I kind of trace directly
I wouldn't say they're directly planning on it. I'm saying that like it does not matter what the individual parts did.
Right.
Eventually, they got close enough to the technology that they were pushed into doing that. So they started to get erratic as it got closer to that, and then you're going to be pushed towards it because it's such a big technological shift.
Well, there was definitely that race to get the bomb for sure, but I can't help but looking at the totality of circumstances over this massive, like, generational period, it just seems to me that World War I and World War II, the real reason for them was that the Zionists needed Germany to fall as the conquering of the Ottoman Empire in order to pave the way for the rise of the state of Israel. Like biblical prophecy bullshit. Like, I just can't help seeing, like, I feel like I saw it and I can't unsee it. You know?
I find it very interesting that it was like what happened with the funding of things like the GMF and with the government the Germans basically saying, right, well, we've got to use the Americans as a proxy, eventually CIA, NGOs, all sorts of things like that as a proxy to be able to defend our backs because we're no longer allowed to defend our own borders, that they were neutered twice to an extent with each of the world wars, and they were taught a lesson that they would never ever forget. And I mean, it must be bad going around being the bad guy, or feel bad going around being the bad guy all the time in history's books, but it's a lot more complicated than that. The other thing I was going to say about the conversation we were having before was about the cultural. I think, you know, a peak of culture ends in a culture eating itself with self-hate, a mixture of self-hate and self-reverence. So there had been such a rich culture for hundreds of years in Germany that it reached this cultural orgy stage, bread and circus moments for this peaking culture. And I think then a lot of people psychologically hate the fact that this culture is no longer the rich, beautiful culture of the past and want to destroy it. And a load of the other people become hedonistic and are unable to see the world for around him, and that causes like some sort of cultural crash that was bound to happen within German society and Russian society in the same way around that time. Because if you look at the rich history of Russia and Germany during those times, it was very culturally based, where the Americans, I said this a few times, and I know a couple of Americans will think, you know, take this as some sort of like this is an insult in some way, but I don't mean it like that. But they were viewed by the rest of the world as being a behemoth with emotionless, soulless, without culture, assimilating everybody else's culture as their own.
Like the Borg.
Yeah, killing off as many Native Americans as possible, and then worshiping their Native American roots. You know, it's they can't help doing it. And
so, I don't say I disagree with you on any of what you just said, but that's talking in large scale societal ideological terms. But I have a feeling if you went back and had the knowledge to specifically go through every civilizational collapse and the individual players who were involved in the decision making, I have a feeling that there might be a particular type of person who was behind all the decisions that led to these societies crumbling, just like we're having in America today. So you might be right on the macro, but on the micro, I think it's always the same story.
Again, but that's a macro thing as well, because I think it comes back to the idea that we are really intriguing. Humans are really intriguing. And I don't know what to do with this data that I'm going to say now, but each of our different cultures and races have like these genetic activities within our genetic code that make the people who are manifest within that culture or created by two folk to suddenly act a certain way. That is clear in loads of different ways. We're not allowed to talk about it. It's another thing we're not allowed to talk about, because when we do talk about it, often people only can talk about it through the prism that the other side talk about it, which is to do something about it. And I don't believe you should necessarily do something about it. So I think you should recognize it for what it is. So,
and I think that's the proper role of a historian. Is not necessarily to come up with a plan to do something, but just say, hey, this is the deal. Now you go do something with it, right?
No, I do think that the genetic route is a really interesting one in general, especially relating to Germany. When I've explained this in one interview I did before, but in the Oberschwabia, where Schwab is from, Oberschwabia is just north of the Swiss border, and it's a very interesting region. It's actually near the Swiss border, makes it near the Italian border, makes it near the Austrian border, makes it near the Bavaria, makes it near North Germany, makes it even en route to France. If you're French and you want to get through any of those areas, you got to get permission from the people of Oberschwabia. And over years and years, of people who succeeded in the genetics that were allowed to prosper the most in that region was one of trade, of allowing to partake in a type of trade that said, we're willing for you to do terrible things, or we're willing to do terrible things at the right cost to keep the peace. And once you then put that frame of mind over every trading situation, you're then willing to make big deals that have massive consequences with people like the Club of Rome, such as Schwab himself do, give away a massive ethical or moral your conscience for some horrible.
See, I would argue that they're not giving away their conscience, and I would argue that the aspect of their governance and their governance models that we have not even touched upon is that there is a heavily entrenched occult aspect to it that has been ever present literally for 100 years, provably, that is an integral part of their decision making and alleviates them of any guilt or any of that stuff. And so there is I don't know if you've gotten to I don't know which of my stuff you've watched, but in my 7-hour video, about 2 hours in, I have about a half an hour on the occultism that was going on in Dealey Plaza. It is the identical occultism that has persisted through to this day.
One of the most controlled spaces. I think Dealey Plaza must have been the most controlled space. Really cleverly controlled. Really, it just seems so suspicious. There's lines of queues of all of these crowds, and then it just goes peace. All of a sudden, you're out in the open. There's people dotted around, running with no security there next to the roads. Makes no sense whatsoever.
It was an extremely controlled. It was a controlled crime scene with people blocking off.
Before the crime had been committed, it was a controlled crime scene.
And they had to, because the majority of the people standing between Houston Street and the grassy area and the slope, not so much on the grassy knoll, but in the street leading up to it. I have located in Dealey Plaza numerous rabbis wearing ceremonial robes and outfits that are part of the celebration for the holiday of Purim. Now, this is extremely significant. Purim is a holiday that celebrates, like most of their holidays, celebrates two things. One, the slaughter of their enemies, and two, the salvation of the Jewish people. This is a theme you will find in all of these Jewish holidays. Purim in particular is the story of Haman, who was an Achaemenid Persian Empire official. And Mordecai was a Jew, and Mordecai refused to bow to Haman. And so Haman got with the king, and they put out a decree to kill all the Jews in the empire because of the situation, right? And so ultimately, you have Esther, who's the star of the story. Her and Mordecai, they're Jews, right? In the land of, technically, this is at the Shushan Temple, which in reality was most likely northern Ethiopia, which makes these a bunch of black people. Basically, Esther and Mordecai, they get all the Jewish people in the land to fast, and ultimately, God intervenes. It's considered a miraculous saving of the Jewish people. Haman gets hanged. Mordecai gets put into Haman's place in the government, and it's happily ever after. right? So that is the story of Purim. And now, when you study the Talmud and like ritual sacrifice, now the people will deny that there's such thing as Jewish ritual sacrifice. It's bullshit. There is Jewish ritual sacrifice. A bunch of goats were saved as they were on their way to the Temple Mount in 2017, where a bunch of Jews were going to slaughter them, right? So sacrifice is most certainly a part of the culture. But after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, according to the religiosity, right, of the sacrifice, you're not allowed to commit a sacrifice because there's nowhere to do it. You're not. You were only allowed to do it at the Temple Mount, and that's it. So after 70 AD, technically Jews were not allowed to commit sacrifice. However, there are two exceptions, and one of those exceptions is that you can commit a sacrifice at a Purim festival, not at the Temple Mount. So, despite the fact that Purim is in March and that the assassination was in November, by holding a symbolic Purim festival, you maintain the legalistic nature of the sacrifice, right? So clearly in Dealey Plaza on Houston Street, in a single frame from the Robert Hughes film, I found 3 rabbis wearing full Purim ceremonial robes. Up on the hill, up on the grassy knoll in front of the pergola, there were a bunch of teenagers there who were wearing what looked like band uniforms. And no one's ever commented on this in the history of Kennedy research. Why are there a bunch of kids wearing band uniforms? Well, they weren't band uniforms. They were children's Purim ceremonial outfits.
Wow, that's good.
Clear as day, and they're standing clear as day on up by the pergola. So the entire audience there, when you look at what they're wearing, they're all wearing some sort of ceremonial robe and hat. There's a teal color that's important to the Purim celebration. There's a whole bunch of people wearing these teal shirts, especially one standing on the stairs at the book depository. And then when you get back into the photographs of immediately after the assassination, there is a large group of Hasidic Jews standing in the railroad yards with guys wearing uniforms that almost look like police uniforms with the flat hat, like an NYPD type hat. I don't know if you'll remember this, but Lee Bowers, the tower man, he said that from his position, he saw men in uniforms. Yeah. At no time did he ever identify them as cops, because they weren't. They were wearing some kind of, I believe, what organization in America in 1963 connected to Israel wears a military uniform like that? There's only one, the IDF. Only one. And I have pictures of these guys behind the grassy knoll after the assassination. And then you go through the photographs and you realize it was a who's who of everybody. I'm talking Ted Shackley, George Ioannidis, Otto Skorzeny was in Dealey Plaza. And Otto Skorzeny, I don't know if you're familiar, he was Hitler's bodyguard. He was considered the elite of all German soldiers. He was after the war, he was recruited by the Mossad to go and shoot his old Nazi buddies, and he did. It is rumored that he murdered. It's rumored he murdered Tesla, but no one really knows. But no, Otto Skorzeny was most certainly an operative. He was actually one of 2 men who had the designation QJ Win. So for many years, people have tried to identify QJ Win. I think it's like one of the easiest things to identify if you understand the era and the people and like ZR Rifle was the execution program, the executive action program. When you go through the ZR Rifle files, it becomes obvious that there were 2. Because they talk about Madrid and they talk about the Corsicans, right, which is in France. So you obviously have 2 different people they're talking about. Then thank God for Hank Albarelli, whose book Coup in Dallas confirmed there were 2 offices of QJ Win, and he identifies Skorzeny as one of them, and I identified the other office of QJ Win as none other than Jean-Pierre Lafitte, international man of mystery, who most people have never heard of. But QJ Win, when you go through the ZR Rifle files and you come to understand the relationships between the CIA and the Executive Action Program and the Mafia, you come to understand that the operative they were using for the recruitment of the grassy knoll shooter was most certainly QJ Win. That's implied in some of the documents, and when you come to realize it was Jean-Pierre Lafitte, that just adds to the magnanimous nature of it, which nobody can write a book on Jean-Pierre Lafitte because there's not enough information on him out there to do so.
That's how I feel about Corbly, really.
But Hank Albarelli tried in Coup in Dallas to write a book written on the scraps from Lafitte's alleged day book. But yeah, So that I forget what we were talking about, but that entire mechanism of like
we're talking about dealer plaza and the controlled nature of it,
right.
the different people you've identified as,
But putting together the
being.
identities of the shooters on the grassy knoll was fucking hard, and it took me years. But the information is there. But here's the thing: I was a cop for a long time, and like I said with my example earlier, a lot of times it's a lot simpler than people think, right? So, like back to my example with the red car in the driveway that the boyfriend murdered. The boyfriend murders the girlfriend in the house, and the neighbor says the red car, right? She provided a detail, number one, that she didn't know was significant. Right? That's how you can verify the statements of witnesses. When they provide information they don't know is significant, but yet they provide it anyway. That's number one, right? And number two, when it comes to Kennedy researchers, even though it'll be that simple, slam dunk, the red car belonged to the boyfriend, the girlfriend was murdered, it's easy, 2 + 2 = 4. In the world of Kennedy research, they'll be like, well, what shade of red was it? Well, what color was the license plate? You can't prove that it was his, even though it was the same car. Like that's the bullshit that you'll get from other researchers who don't know what the fuck they're doing. And I credit my ability to like kind of boil shit down to simplicity because I worked thousands of cases as an actual cop and I saw how simple things were. And so when I see multiple descriptions of a man on the 6th floor of the book depository who looks like a Hispanic with dark complexion and he's got numerous bumps on his face or moles on his face, in 50 years, no one's identified this fucking guy. But when you go through the known list of characters in the assassination and who was doing what where, do you have a husky Latino guy with dark complexion who had bumps on his face from moles? Yeah, you do. You got one. His name's Lawrence Howard. And so then when you study Lawrence Howard, you connect him to 2 other guys. A guy named Lauren Hall, who was another mercenary, and then another guy named William Seymour. And oh my God, William Seymour looks just like Lee Harvey Oswald. And so then you start to study William Seymour and you start to realize that William Seymour was one of the 2 men who was impersonating Oswald all the fuck over the place, everywhere from Miami in 1961 to Bolton Ford, January 1960, that first incident at Bolton Ford, to Miami in 61, to the incidents leading up to the assassination, which put the rifle in Oswald's hand, right? The shooting at General Walker's house, which is what they said linked the rifle to Lee Harvey Oswald and Oswald to the shooting. Well, the bullet they pulled out of the freaking wall at Walker's was from a Mauser 7.65. It was not from a Carcano, right? So, but when you look at the testimony of the neighbor, whose name was Kirk Coleman, who was a 14-year-old boy who heard the shots at Walker's house, came out, looked over the fence. He saw 2 men get into 2 different vehicles and drive away. One of them was a tall guy, about 6 foot, with a dark complexion. Hello, are we starting to see the same people over and over again? Right? We have witnesses at the Carousel Club who saw Oswald at the Carousel Club with a dark-complected Mexican who had numerous bumps on his face. Same guy popping up all over the place for 3 years leading up to the assassination, and not one fucking Kennedy researcher in the world has had the balls to put his finger on who this is. It was Lawrence Howard, and William Seymour, his partner, was involved heavily in the setup of Oswald, like at the shooting range. Oswald allegedly went and shot at people's targets. Well, when you go and you read through the statements of the people who were there, Oswald was never there. It was clearly William Seymour with a large guy with a dark complexion, okay, who had really big feet. Obviously, the relationship is between William Seymour and Lawrence Howard. So when you see Oswald with a guy with dark complexion and bumps on his face, looks like a Mexican, which I have literally a dozen different incidents involving. You can say with absolute certainty that was William Seymour and he was with Lawrence Howard. And that's how I know this, because of the relationship between these 2 guys and the fact that it matches the description everywhere over a 3-year period, right? So to me, this is my ultimate frustration with Kennedy. That some other fucking idiot should have figured this shit out years ago. Really, like,
man, I feel about this about loads of stuff. So the Schwab pieces I did, I felt like this about loads of the stuff that I looked at in the Black Hand series. I just like, I can't understand why no one else. When I was researching Yankum, I felt like no one else. And I mean, there is a split in character and the difference between research. It's not just about style. It needs to be that you have to be able to realize that 3 points of information that all point at the same thing mean something, and then go on through that and see where that leads you. And if it leads you to more information about the same thing, that's very suspicious, and you can make, and if it leads to the entire story unraveling in front of you, then you've taken that road for a reason, and that road needs to be taken because that's where the evidence leads. Now,
if you don't have a burning desire to have the answer, you're never going to get anywhere in fucking research. Like,
yeah, but a lot of people are scared.
You.
Deep down, you're scared to have the answer because the answer could stop them doing everything they're doing, and they feel that. I just think there's a sense of what you're describing about the people who are Kennedy researchers haven't come to terms with what they're doing yet, and they're scared to. It's like a game that they're going to lose if they admit that that's true. The person who's already knows it and already telling it has made the discovery or has already knows this, and that means you have to give up part of your ego and you've got to give up part of something else, and people just crumble under those simple exchanges of ego. You know, I understand sometimes somebody tells me something that I've thought for a long time, and then they tell me to give me information that shows it's true, and a little bit my ego is hurt. Of course it is, but then I get over it very quickly. Some people, that is like, if your ego isn't intact, then basically you'll have a whole crisis, and that's what I think most of it is people who just can't accept from somebody else what they've discovered. But if they were doing it right, they'd look at it and say, well, what does that mean? Well, what does that mean? Right. And that's the proper researcher, is the person who sees all the information, sees it and says, okay, that makes sense. Now, what does that mean? And go on.
Right. And when I look at research that's just like totally off the wall, I look at it from the perspective of like, okay, is this organic? Did this idea come from nowhere, or did it all of a sudden pop up on 3 JFK forums simultaneously? Is it being planted? And also, when someone is pretty dead set on a theory, it has to be able to be integrated with other facts, right? So when, like, I have 100% confidence that I have identified all the shooters, the handlers, the money flow, like the whole thing. Now, I have an associate who spent way more years on this than me, but he focused more on the relationships between the Israelis leading to guys like Clay Shaw and stuff that I still need to discover, right? There's still a ton of stuff that I don't know. But in as far as like, I started with the micro details, the shooters, you know, who the right witnesses were, all that stuff. But so now when somebody presents a theory to me, I know whether or not it integrates with mine, right? It can be something I didn't discover yet, but I can look at it and be like, oh, okay, I see what you're saying, and that connects over here, right? So it has to, it's literally like a jigsaw puzzle, that the pieces actually have to fit together. And that's another thing with research, is like, you can have 60% of the pieces and you know what needs to go where, right? So you just understand the totality of the incident or circle or whatever historical event you're studying, and you can see it all at once, and you can see which patches are you don't have, right? And you understand the relationship between what you don't know and what you do know, right? So it's, honestly, just wanting to know who the shooter on the grassy knoll was, like, changed my entire fucking life and made me a different person from who I was when I started 5 years ago. On Kennedy in particular.
Definitely understand that. In that sense, understanding who Laura Koonsberg, the political editor of the BBC, was, started my journey, and discovering that her grandfather had part created the NHS and her father had been the only factory in Peru, I think it was, that didn't have to abide by a certain law that gave his workers rights, and going along this path led me to the same sort of change my life. And it's silly, isn't it, the thirst for information. Listen, you've given me a good amount to think about, and there's a load of other stuff I'd love to speak to you about. That's I
have a habit of getting on a show to talk about Kennedy, and then we don't end up talking about Kennedy. So,
well, we did a lot at all. I mean,
I did, but I have like infinite more. I have the specifics on what happened in the book depository, how the shooters got away, where they went.
I like the idea of focusing up on some of these, but there's also like, what does this mean, and where are we now? Moment that I'd like to kind of discuss with you. Maybe I mean, obviously you're on the same independent scene. There's some brilliant people on it. Hopefully we'll cross over sometime and we can have a conversation about this on another platform with a couple other people, because the more input the better. Again, that's what research is about, isn't it? I really thank you for your time. Some of that really, really just has me thinking about when you're talking about integrating someone else's views, a lot of what you've said today allows me to say, okay, that makes sense, and that makes sense, and that makes sense. And it's like a lot of different stuff. I still like to remain on the outskirts, and I like that someone else has already covered a hell of a lot of this ground already. That makes it really easier for when I come in sort of like a tangent, and there is a tangent to be had here because I got a couple of different sort of areas of focus that lead me towards Kennedy, and I've been walking there for a long time, and it'll lead me to a different part of the story, and be able to explain something myself. So I think we're going to have a beautiful relationship.
And there's a bunch of things that there's a bunch of things that I know that I don't know that I need to know, that I need help with. Like, I know Clay Shaw was in Dallas with Erwin Heyman, who was the representative of the Jewish agency in Switzerland. I can't prove that, but I know it happened. So I know the proof is out there. There's a lot of things like that.
Oh, when I know the proof is out there, I just, it's when you get a thirst for it. Trying to
the biggest one for me is Hank Greenspun, who ran the Sun newspaper. I'm sure you're familiar with Greenspun.
I go on.
Watergate was completely about Kennedy. It had nothing to do with bugging the DMC, the Democratic National Headquarters. Hank Greenspun, who was one of the plotters in it, in the
that's where I know the name from. I'm doing research on that right now, and when we finish recording here, I'll ask you a few questions about this.
He sent a letter that is known as the Hank Greenspun letter, that basically is the cause of Watergate and why they broke in there and why they were planning on breaking into his office, because allegedly he had information in a safe that had the whole plot. And so that, I know the Greenspun letter, I know, is out there. I know people who have read it in the past, and there's no copies available for me to find. So that I'm looking for. There's a bunch of things. We'll get together on this stuff.
Sure. I think we probably coordinate. Well, like I say, I mean, where is best to find you? Because you've obviously got your own website, but you've also got a book coming out. Tell us a little bit about what's going on.
Sure. My book, I have, like I said, I have 3 chapters to go. It will be done probably, what is it? Are we in May yet? It'll probably be done in 4 to 6 weeks. It'll probably be out for sale in July. But here's the thing. You can pre-order my book now. And when you pre-order my book, you get 4 chapters and you get my entire notes, 630 pages of notes.
Wow.
With, it's got everything. It's got shit that isn't even going to make it into this book. It's got, all my slides that has images, documents, all my proof. You get that when you pre-order my book for $25, and you get access to my private Telegram chat. I got a bunch of lunatics in there, so we have a great time. But yeah, you can get that at buymeacoffee.com/JFKbook, and you get access to all that stuff immediately. And then CoreyHughes.org is my website. But yeah, I'm really excited about the next couple months. Is gonna be good for me.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to be supporting it. I love the sound of all of this, and we're going to talk loads. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks, Johnny. I appreciate it.